everybody takes a different kind of approach, and for me, I can only speak for myself. And that is that I like to just completely and totally immerse myself into a story, follow it for a really, really long time, and then just see what happens. And that's exactly what I've done for my whole entire career. And the Rohingya is one of those stories to where, I feel like I have a greater understanding of the complexities of when these big, huge bursts take place, because I've just followed the story in between those troughs, and I hope that the work that I have produced, people can look back on it and say, okay, now I have a better understanding as to why this happened, or what were some of the contributing factors to why 2012 happened or 2017 happened. And this particular photographer's work has made some kind of small contribution in helping to kind of unpack that and make it a little bit more understandable. But they were excluded from mainstream society. The Rohingya was a bit different in that sense, because here you had a huge community of people that were not only stateless inside of Rakhine State, but also you had tens of thousands at that point in period of time of people who were Rohingya, who were stateless, and who had been thrust across an international border and were also refugees at the same time. Almost every single box was ticked off with the Rohingya community. Displacement, disempowerment, marginalization, the denial of rights, the lack of denial of education, the denial of the rejection of identity, all of those things were all packaged together with the Rohingya community.
The situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There is no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar Podcast find this intolerable, and we stand behind the Burmese people in their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going, while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those voices, and I invite you to settle in and open up to what follows. On this episode of Insight Myanmar Podcast, we welcome Greg Constantine. Greg, thanks for stopping by and taking the time to chat with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it.
So the bulk of this interview, we're going to get into the project you've been doing of documenting Rohingya history and the website associated with that, which is really fascinating. But I think before we get to that piece, I think to better understand what you were doing and why you were doing it, it's your own journey of how you got interested in this part of the world and these people, which led to really the importance of this interactive, robust, dynamic website that you've built. So if you could flesh out your background that brought you to Burma and to the plight of the Rohingya people and what led you to this great thing that you've created.
Yeah. I think, my kind of history with the Rohingya stories would have started back in 2006. Mm-hmm. So I spent, I'm photographer. I work on these really kind of long-term immersive projects. And I spent 11 years working on a project that was called Nowhere People. Mm-hmm. And that project basically documented the lives of, I guess you could say, stateless communities all around the world. And it originally was intended to just be a couple photo essays on stateless communities here in Asia, Southeast Asia, and clearly, I think anybody who does any kind of work on global statelessness in the world would be pretty much negligent if they didn't include the Rohingya community. So I started that work. I think I would have made my first trip to southern Bangladesh in early 2006, and with no expectation of what would happen. And I think I was just so, it was a story back in 2006 that really nobody was paying any kind of attention to. I mean, even though the Rohingya had been thrust into international news several decades at a time, in 2006 it really was kind of like an abandoned story, I think, for most people. But because I was coming to it through the lens of statelessness and this arbitrary denial of citizenship, it was very new for me. So I was in Bangladesh and was just completely shocked with what I kind of saw and the stories that I heard, and was just kind of even more amazed that there was just no media coverage on that story whatsoever. So it didn't take very long for me to realize how complex the story was. And I just kept going back. I think I made probably 12 trips to southern Bangladesh before 2012. And with every single trip, it was just kind of peeling away a new layer to that story. So one trip would be all about, there was a point in time where a lot of young people were coming out of Rakhine State because they were facing so many problems in getting permission to get married. And so one whole entire trip just focused on dealing with documenting the stories of young couples that basically had been forced to leave home because their families had been extorted more money than they could give out anymore, or that they had been harassed so much by Nasaka at that time. And they really had no choice but to come to Bangladesh. So it was those kind of stories. And then all of a sudden, the boat traffic started to happen, and that thrust the Rohingya into the news. And it's just one of those stories to where the Rohingya come in and out of the news cycle then, consistently. And I was always interested in really focusing my attention on those moments where the Rohingya were not in the news cycle. So going to Bangladesh was just, all those times just made sense. And at the same time, North Rakhine State's completely closed off, and there was really nothing happening in Sittwe at the time. In 2000, this would have been 2006 to 2012, and all my attention was in Bangladesh. And the story just became more multi-layered in terms of how I was documenting it. But the root part of all that, the commonality between all of the reporting that I'd done, was always about the atrocities being committed against the community. What was the aftermath of the persecution that the community was being faced with, year in and year out and year in and year out. 2012 kind of came around, or when the euphoria over the democratic reforms started to take place, that's when the first book, or when the book of my work was published. And that was very intentional. I mean, I knew that my work wasn't over with, but it was almost as if like something needs to be out there to almost add a counterbalance to all this euphoria taking place. And so the book was published, and then everything happened in 2012, where I could get access as a photographer to the surrounding areas outside of Sittwe and do more reporting on what had happened during that violence then. So I probably made 5 trips to Rakhine State from 2012 until 2016, just constantly, again, peeling away another layer, working on stories about the aftermath of the denial of medical care, or the lack of freedom of movement, or all of those things that ended up happening as an extension of that violence, but in the placement of all these terrible internment camps. I mean, really, they're not internally displaced camps. They're internment camps. And that whole kind of apartheid-like existence that you had heard about was really very, very, it took on a physical transformation in 2012, I found. So it was working on all of that. And then I got blacklisted and couldn't go back. But the timing of when that happened was right before 2017. And as we all know, I mean, you had 2016 happen, then you had 2017 happen at a whole bigger level than anything. And I was back in Bangladesh. So my commitment to the Rohingya story, it's been ongoing now for almost 18 years. And it's just developed and evolved in a lot of different a lot of different kind of ways. I mean, 2017 for me was I mean, I hesitate to say this, but it wasn't a breaking news story for me, because I had 12 years or 11 years of constant work on the story. So I knew the backstory. And when 2017 happened, I think I came into that whole experience with a little bit of a different eye, and also a very different kind of motivation than just documenting the atrocities. And I think the work ended up reflecting that. I mean, yeah, I photographed the situation for people coming across, but I made probably 4 more trips after 2017 to almost like take a very forensic kind of approach towards things. And that's kind of led to kind of where I am right now. So.
Right. So when you first got involved in understanding what the Rohingya crisis was and reporting on it, you reference how at that time you were documenting displaced peoples around the world. Yep. And so what I'm curious about is in what ways you were seeing the Rohingya situation as something that was consistent with the tragedies and traumas that displaced people everywhere have, and in what ways was it an outlier? And I preface that question by saying that I imagine there were some pretty profound ways it was an outlier, because, and this is the second part of the question, in what ways of all the different stories that you were following at that time for that initial focus, what was it about the Rohingya that had you kept coming back again and again to further understand it, when there was this whole history and experience of displacement around the world at that time in general?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll kind of almost refine what you've just asked, and that is that that Project Nowhere People, it wasn't on displaced people. It was all on ethnic communities where the state had weaponized citizenship and had arbitrarily deprived them of that fundamental right. And what does that look like? I mean, what does it look like, this very kind of obscure concept of citizenship and all the package of rights and everything that goes along with it? What does that look like when it's removed from not only you as an individual and a family, but as an entire community? So that's what that project worked on. And the reality of it is most of the communities for that Nowhere People project that I documented were communities that had never left their home country. They had never crossed a border. Generation after generation of people from their families had been born in a particular place, had lived in there, but they were excluded from mainstream society. The Rohingya was a bit different in that sense, because here you had a huge community of people that were not only stateless inside of Rakhine State, but also you had tens of thousands at that point in period of time of people who were Rohingya, who were stateless, and who had been thrust across an international border and were also refugees at the same time. But I think the reason why I kept going back to that story is because if I thought about almost like all the different characteristics that make up this theme of statelessness, let's just say, I don't think that there was any other community that had been so incredibly paralyzed by all of those different characteristics than the Rohingya community.
Kind of perfect storm.
Exactly. Like that whole structural element of violence, almost every single box was ticked off with the Rohingya community. Displacement, disempowerment, marginalization, the denial of rights, the lack of denial of education, the denial of the rejection of identity. All of those things were all packaged together with the Rohingya community. And that was unlike any other community that I had photographed at that particular time, or that I would photograph, because I went to 18 different countries for that project, and every single community was a bit different. But the Rohingya was the one that really, for that Project Nowhere People, served as the centerpiece, as this is about as bad as it can probably get when you're dealing with the issue of statelessness. And also, I guess each community for that particular project it comes into it. My involvement or my introduction into each one of those communities came into a whole different package of historical contexts with each one of them. the Rohingya was, very unique in that sense, the historical side of things. So I think that's the reason why I just was committed to the story. I have been for so long, but that period of time, definitely, because honestly, I think it was one of those things where nobody was really spending a lot of time on it.
You talk about it checking a lot of boxes, and that's what drove you to want to understand more about the nature and context and have questions answered. But what about it gripped your feeling, gripped your emotion, gripped who you were as a person to want to, outside of the boxes being checked, that made you want to be involved as passionately and consistently as you would end up being?
I think there were a couple different factors. I think one was, Rohingya are really poetic in the way that they describe things.
Right.
And you can hear and listen to someone talk about, I guess you could say, this deep exclusion, this deep rejection of a place that you in yourself feel like you belong to, in your family and history and everything. But there was something about the way that Rohingya articulated that sense of having been excluded from this place that they have called home for however long anybody wants to argue, you know what I mean? And I think that was something that was just really different, and you heard that from both men and women. And I'm not just saying that the poetic side of them was a reason. It was just that there was something that I think came across in the way that they articulated their situation and all the different complexities of it all, that I just wanted to continue to keep interrogating, both visually and interview-wise and investigatively and everything. And I think that's one of the reasons why I just kept going back over and over and over again.
You also mentioned how you reference how there are these flare-ups with the Rohingya where they gained the world's attention for a period of time, but you emphasize how your presence was there not just during those flare-ups, but during the time that no one was paying attention, when it might seem to outside observers like not much was happening, but you found a lot was happening there that then would go on to explain what happened when those situations came up. And this is a common theme that I've talked about with several guests, not so much about the Rohingya, more about the anti-military underground democracy movement that we've seen for all these years, particularly with like Elliot Prase-Freeman and Delphine Schrank. Talked with them in quite some detail about this because their work is focused on that, and just referenced how when people try to understand Myanmar, it's 88, 2007, 2021, maybe some years in the transition period, certainly 2017, but it kind of presupposes this sense that nothing is happening, it's very boring, there's nothing to report. Sometimes the past guests I've spoke to, they said that fellow academics, diplomats, reporters, whoever it was, would introduce them by saying, there's nothing really going on here. And so then there becomes this sense that when 2007 happens or whatever it is, then suddenly it's like, oh, this came from nowhere. Wow, look at, and then it goes back into nowhere. And that's really a kind of Western or outside really active ignorance and disinterest in trying to understand what's happening beyond the headlines and events that are grabbing us, that actually explain those headlines and events in much better terms than just, oh, something happened out of nowhere. Isn't this interesting? And so it's interesting to take that understanding of this kind of underground democracy movement in the years when the big headlines aren't happening, and look at it that same kind of view with the Rohingya, that there are years that everyone will point to when it was international news and every international organization and newspaper and government and everything else, but then that is precluding and ignoring really the underlying reality that's happening in between those big moments, and that's also leading to those big moments to happen. So, what, as someone who has this has been on your radar far before it was an international news story, and long after people lost interest or their attention span was limited and they went somewhere else, what's your feeling on on covering a conflict and a people consistently, whatever's making the headlines, and then seeing when suddenly it does make the headlines, how the international community is understanding it or misunderstanding it, kind of the relation between those two different moments in time.
Yeah. I think that, well, when you talk about a story like the Rohingya, the fact is that like it's always a good thing that the story is in the news cycle. I mean, really. But just like you've said, I mean, there are things that happen in those silent moments that are actually setting the stage for some of these things to take place. And I think that it's really important for there to be some kind of record that shows that these are not spontaneous events, that one thing has led to the next, has led to the next, has led to the next, and then this happens. And it's that process. Yeah. And I feel like, let's put it this way, as journalists, everybody takes a different kind of approach, and for me, I can only speak for myself. And that is that I like to just completely and totally immerse myself into a story, follow it for a really, really long time, and then just see what happens. And that's exactly what I've done for my whole entire career. And the Rohingya is one of those stories to where, I feel like I have a greater understanding of the complexities of when these big, huge bursts take place because I've just followed the story in between those troughs, and I hope that the work that I have produced, people can look back on it and say, okay, now I have a better understanding as to why this happened, or what were some of the contributing factors to why 2012 happened or 2017 happened. And this particular photographer's work has made some kind of small contribution in helping to kind of unpack that and make it a little bit more understandable, I mean, that's kind of, I can only speak for myself when it comes to why I've done it the way that I have all these years.
What would be an example of a moment where the work that you were doing when it wasn't so much in the headlines gave you an understanding to better understand something that happened when it did come in the headlines?
Yeah. When a perfect example would be in the years leading up to the first boat movements taking place, I'd go to Bangladesh from 2006 until 2009. And during every single one of those trips, you could just feel it getting worse and worse. That the desperation that Rohingya were feeling in those camps was just elevating every single year. That the reasons behind why Rohingya were trickling out of NRS at that time into Bangladesh, they were pretty complex reasons. Forced labor was a huge deal. They were building the border wall between the forced labor. Rohingya were being forced to do that. Denial of marriage, lack of freedom of movement. I mean, all those things are things that are completely intangible when it comes to the news cycle, but in the practical day-to-day lives of people, right, when you are pressurized that bad, it then triggers something to happen. And when the camps started to get really, really intense leading up to, you could feel that moment. And then all of a sudden you start to see boat movements. And it was kind of put into the news cycle. And for good reason. I think that gave me a better understanding as to why these hundreds upon, or if not thousands of people were taking this very, very dangerous journey from inside of Burma and from Bangladesh to Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. It just made more sense having come through it. And again, I just hope that the work at that particular period of time would give people a little bit more of a frame of reference as to what was happening and why these people were getting on those boats. So that'd be an example that I'd give you.
Another thing is when you first became involved in wanting to understand this story and report on this people, you reference coming back on many repeated trips to try to uncover more, go to more places, talk to more people. I assume that was predicated off of a kind of mystery of a host of unanswered questions that you were really seeking to try to understand what's going on here. So what were some of those questions that were really driving you at the heart of that search?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, I think that there came a point in time to where when I first started working on the Rohingya, it was very much kind of like reporting driven. But then that changed or I don't want to say changed because it's always been reporting driven, but it just evolved into curiosities and having to feel like there was more that I wanted to know about. And, I going back to denial of marriage, let's just say, I mean, it's a concept that most people just can't even fathom, imagine, that you would end up leaving your family behind in very, very tense circumstances because you denied this fundamental kind of like rite of passage for most people in the world, or however you want to define it. But, and all the package of complications that came along with that, from the extortion to the potential jail time from family members, all those things. And then finally to where a family gets to a point that says, the two of you young couple, if you want to have a normal life, it's not going to be here. You're going to have to leave, and you're going to have to go across the border. You have to leave your homeland. I mean, those are kind of questions that, on one trip, I just remember hearing that a couple people saying, yeah, there's a lot of people coming over because of this. And I didn't have enough time on that particular trip. But on the following trip, that was the focus of the whole entire, most of that trip. And it gave me a better understanding of, it's funny because even though the Rohingya story in so many ways has been, and this ties into, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later, but the Rohingya story is so much defined on physical violence, yet at the same time, it's those invisible forms of violence that don't fit into what most people would consider to be a violent act are actually the things that have, in a lot of ways, done a considerable more damage to the Rohingya community, short-term and long-term wise. And I think those in that invisible form of violence is something that, for those early years of working on that story, those were the things that were pushing people out, making people leave. And those are also topics that, you're not going to find in the traditional media. I mean, nobody's going to be really spending any time on that. But for this particular community, it was very, very significant. And I wanted to explore that.
So in addition to exploring the Rohingya community, their lack of rights, the temperature boiling up on each visit, as you describe, were you also able to explore the other side of it, the aggressor that was putting them in this situation, and try to understand who they were, how they felt, what they were doing, what was pushing this, putting these people in these increasingly deplorable situations?
Yeah. I would say that from 2006 until 2012, all of my attention was on the aftermath of the reception of that violence against the Rohingya community. I was never exposed to the other side, the perpetrator, I guess you can say. But 2012 happened, and I made 4 or 5 trips to Sittwe, and that was a big focus, because I was in a place where, to an extent, you could see and feel that, the beginnings of that hatred, racism, exclusion, violence. I mean, you could feel that. And that was, I think, a vitally important part of, for me, in the trajectory of the work that I've done on the Rohingya, not just visually, but also to have greater understanding. I mean, I just remember being in Sittwe and talking with people from the Rakhine Buddhist community at that time. And, I'm not making any generalizations, but the people that I was talking to at that point in time, they were, very directional in terms of how they felt about the Rohingya community. And I think one of the things for me was hearing that coming from people is something I needed to almost hear to help better understand the previous 6 years of work that I had done, and even though that was coming specifically out of, let's just say, the surrounding areas of Sittwe, which is far away from North Rakhine State, but it didn't take long to kind of have a little bit more of a better understanding of just how much bigger this was, and what was the kind of demographics of a larger community that was driving some of these things at that time. I mean, I remember in 2014 there I found out that there was going to be a big, huge mass anti-UN, anti-Rohingya protest taking place in Sittwe, and I managed to be able to get on a flight and get to Sittwe just in time for that. And I remember there were several thousand people in the demonstrating on that day. And I think you'd be naive to think that some of those weren't orchestrated in terms of who was brought in intentionally and everything. But there was a very authentic feeling behind that demonstration on that day. And particularly some of the leaders who were speaking at that time at that demonstration. And it was really, I think, the first time where I could feel that antagonism towards this community in some pretty radical kind of ways, and that helped inform me in terms of how I continued with the work, and a much bigger holistic kind of understanding of what was happening at that particular time.
I'm also asking because, and I don't know if this is outside of your purview, but I've heard a couple different varying explanations on the side of the military why they were going to these lengths, and these aren't mutually exclusive. There could be some intersection with them. One being just a pure hatred, racial contempt, racism, genocidal racism to simply want to punish a people based on their background, just pure and simple definition of ethnic cleansing and racism in general. The other being that, well, the military need an enemy. They always need an enemy. And what they did to the Rohingya was really just a more violent and brutal and condensed version of what they've been doing to everyone, including their own people, as we're seeing now. And they don't really even begin to understand who this military is. They're crazy. They're uneducated. They're these insane bullies that just do things that are cruel for the sake of cruelty. And so this behavior that was exhibited towards the Rohingya, as bad as it is, it's really just a more condensed form of their evil brutality as we see throughout history and today of the rest of the country. And so I wonder if in your study, in your reading, research, conversations, etc., if you gleaned any sense from the military, if they were motivated by a particular unique contempt for this group of people above and beyond all else, and even at odds with their own, to their own benefit. It was kind of, they had such a fury with it, or if this was just kind of a symptom of a really evil and corrupt military that is just doing this all the time to everyone in all directions.
Yeah. I don't feel like I prescribe to the belief of just generally evil. I mean, I really do feel that the situation with the Rohingya is there is a unique characteristic to it. I think that I wouldn't want to almost like level this out by just defining this as being an evil regime. I mean, there's a lot of different actors, as we all know, who have all played their part in what's happened in Rakhine State, and I don't think it'd be very realistic to just reduce that down to the regime.
Yeah.
And that's historical too. I mean, this isn't just like the last 15, 20 years. I mean, there's been a number of different actors over decades that have all kind of contributed to everything in Rakhine State, and with the Rohingya community. And I also at the same time, I don't think it's really even realistic to try to reduce down the driving factors between all of that, amongst all of that, into something that's very neatly defined. I think that there's a lot of historical complexities behind it. I think that there's a lot of contributing factors that have brought the situation to these key moments over the past few decades, and which has then led to where we are today. So I don't know if that answers your question or
No,
not. But,
it definitely does.
and I don't want to hide behind like it's complex, because it is complex, but there's some things that are, very easy to kind of see and understand, that are very clear in terms of that, I mean, historically, I mean, and the regime has always, like it has with everyone, it's played communities off of each other for its own purposes and sowed those kind of hatreds. And the regime is not the only one that has done that as well. So yeah.
So given that as you mentioned, the regime, the current military and in previous iterations is not the only bad actor that has been the agent of Rohingya suffering, what do you think it is about this people particularly which has made them such a target of so many different actors from so many backgrounds to want to go out of their way to pick on and make their life miserable?
I'll tell you, I don't think it can be answered in one answer. I really don't. And I don't think it can be, I don't think that you can say, oh, it's only just because it's a Muslim community in a Buddhist country. I don't think it could be reduced down to that. I don't think that you can say that this is a community where, open borders during British colonial times resulted in migration. I don't think you can reduce it down to that either. But I just think that there's certain particular narratives that have been exploited and manipulated and spun for various different reasons that has then created this situation, So yeah, I think it'd be doing the Rohingya community and what they've gone through all these years a very, very big disservice to reduce that down to one definable kind of answer. Yeah.
How do they understand and express to you and articulate the suffering they've been through? How do they make sense of it? How do they respond to it? What have you gleaned from those conversations?
I think that Rohingya who I've talked to, and I can only stress here that I'm just giving my own subjective opinion based on what Rohingya have shared with me. So no way am I speaking for the Rohingya community whatsoever. I would never do that. But just based on what people have told me is that, and shared with me, is that, there's two primary dynamics that have always existed within Rakhine State. It's the relationship with the central government and the relationship between the Buddhist community and the Muslim community, and at various points in time, those have clashed in a way. And there's been moments where some of the Rohingya would say that some of those defining moments for them have come from something that's been driven through policy, through the central government, but how it's then implemented on a local level by others is a whole different thing, I mean, you can talk about like the 1982 citizenship law and everything, but I think a lot of Rohingya suffering over all these decades has been something that has translated on how it's applied arbitrarily on a local level. I mean, I think that, how would I describe how Rohingya have almost tried to understand the atrocities that have been perpetrated against them. The reality of it has been going on for so many decades that each generation has almost like it comes into it from a different perspective. I mean, you speak to 70-year-olds and they have a very different perspective as to why all of this has happened. You talk to somebody who's in their 20s right now and they're going to give you a little bit of a different answer because they come into it from a different generation, a different perspective as well. And then you have people who, their lives seem to have just been put completely on pause because of 2017, because of a lost husband or wife or children or something, and they'll give you a different answer in that sense. So I think everybody has. I've had the privilege of being able to spend so much time with Rohingya over all these years that I kind of feel like I've been exposed to this wide spectrum of all these different things, that reasons that that not one of them is the reason, but when you put all of them together collectively, it all makes a little bit more sense. So
what would be some things that stand out from those conversations?
Like take for example, you can talk with, I can talk with older Rohingya who are in their 70s now, and they will all, most of them will end up saying something to the degree of, there was a time, I mean, like when I had friends who were from the Rakhine community, and we were going to university in Yangon, and we were all these things. They have a frame of reference that I think is so critical right now, because they know what life was like before everything went bad. And those stories are pretty painful for them, because they've seen the trajectory, the downward trajectory of this community from what it did have at a particular period of time, So their descriptions of that loss, that sense of loss and deprivation, I don't want to use the word suffering, but it's that sense of loss, is really, really deep, You talk with somebody who's in their 20s and 30s, and they've known nothing other than that. Mm. And a lot of their stories come from the depths and the degrees of what they've experienced, that's all basically packaged and defined by some kind of form of violence. Mm-hmm. And almost to a degree to where it's this almost like this yearning for a normality that they know that they've never had in their life, and that they wish they could have. Going to school, being able to travel, I mean, all those things. So that's a bit of a difference in terms of the story that you hear, that I hear when I compare different demographics within the Rohingya community, and not one is more painful than the other. I mean, really, when you think about it, it's all collectively pieces together a community that's gone through a lot over 60, 70 years. Yeah. In varying degrees. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the world today, their starting point and frame of reference for the Rohingya community comes with 2017. It's not informed by the decades that came before that. So, yeah.
After the 2021 military coup, there were some Burmese that were surprised to see that many Rohingya started to take photos of themselves with the three-finger salute and show their solidarity with the Burmese activists, and also express sympathy with the brutality that the military was treating them with, having experienced this before. And I think there was surprise among many Bamar that was expressed, because they had recognized they had been on the wrong side of history and not standing up for and defending Rohingya, and did not expect that kind of response, expected something a bit more harsh or just desserts or whatnot. So I wonder if you saw some of that interaction online as it was taking place, and what your thoughts were as that was manifesting.
I did see that, and my reaction was not in surprise for how the Rohingya were acting. It was more just how ill-informed people from other communities were about the realities of who this community is, the history. I mean, it also just shows the depths behind how decades worth of manipulating narratives that have come from the regime over all of these years has really come to be the accepted belief from other communities about the Rohingya community, And when I saw photographs of young Rohingya, expressing their solidarity with other communities, it didn't surprise me, because if you really look back historically, the Rohingya community, going back even to the 40s, has always believed that they are a community from Burma really, that's what it is. And that's been one of the really interesting parts of the process of working on this new project, this recent project, is that I didn't fully recognize that, I mean, decade after decade after decade, you continually see this is a community that kept saying, we belong here. We are not foreigners. Don't this tactic that you're taking to label us as somebody that doesn't belong here, we are resisting you labeling us as that because we believe we are people from Burma. Arakan is always going to be home, but the fact is that we are always going to be people from Burma in that sense. And so it didn't, in solidarity with other communities who were suffering the same as the Rohingya, maybe to different degrees. So in that sense, it didn't surprise me, but it was also kind of like unfortunate that it's taken 2021 to take place and the events after that for a lot of communities to almost come to terms and I would say that that's probably a very small percentage of people that reacted in that way, which is unfortunate, but it's unfortunate that it took 2021 for that to open up the minds of some people, and you just hope that that would continue moving forward,
Mm-hmm. Right. I know we're jumping around a lot in all your research. It's fascinating stuff. I do want to get to the projects that you've actually been doing so we can land some of this content and analysis into the work that you've actually published. So the first thing to reference, we actually referenced it before. I was introduced to you through the interview with Andrea Gittleman at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and referencing a project that you did in relation to the museum and the exhibition. So can you tell us about that one?
Well, I was in 2000, I had twice before, the museum had run outdoor projections of my work on the Rohingya on the outside walls of the museum. That would have been in 2013 and then 2018. So I already had a relationship with the museum, and I already knew that they were very interested in the Rohingya story and everything. And then in 2019, they approached me about this idea that they had to do this major exhibition. And they were already familiar with my work. And so it was, believe that particular period of time that, this is almost like the most amazing opportunity for me as a photographer who's followed this story for so many years to be able to try to share that knowledge with other people and work with a team of people at the museum to make that happen. And I was guest curator of that exhibition. And it was a pretty incredible experience of putting that exhibition together, using all the different the teams of advisors that we had, trying to put together the right narrative of everything. And I think we're all very, very happy with how it landed. And to be honest with you, it's not really for me to say that we're happy. It's that the reaction that Rohingya have given in terms of their feedback for that exhibition is the thing that almost makes sense. The exhibition kind of went up, and I had given everything to putting together that exhibition. And I went through several kind of months of almost very, very deep reflection after the exhibition had gone up about, my role as a photographer, my role as a journalist, my relationship with the Rohingya story as a whole. And I think it just got to the point to where instincts and curiosity started to kick back in again. I think that exhibition is so vital for people's greater understanding about the Rohingya community, but not just about the Rohingya community, but it's about this protracted sense of the process that takes place with genocide. And this goes back to just allowing people to come to some recognition that this is something, that these acts are not something that just happen spontaneously, that there's oftentimes they're planned out. There's steps along the way that situations are brought to the fore to where that makes communities more vulnerable. And you mix in social media with all of this, or the proliferation of communications and everything, and it just makes the situation ripe for what was going to happen in 2017. And I think that's one of the powerful parts of that exhibition, is that it does almost allow people to see that backstory behind it, but also at the same time it shows the survival of a certain number of people from the Rohingya community who I think are representative of the larger community from the village of Maung Nu and what they went through. It gave them a platform to have a voice. So I think that was really important. But after the exhibition went up, I ended up just, again, thinking about myself, and it was almost as if like that visual identity of the Rohingya community today in most people's eyes is very much portrayed by violence, victimhood, statelessness, you know, refugee life, the excluded, the unwanted, the desperate. I mean, really, that in so many ways is how the community is portrayed in the eyes and identified to people. I know that there's a whole other side to that story. And in thinking specifically from a very personal side of myself, I believe that has been crucial to be reporting on the atrocities that a state does on a particular community, like what's happened to the Rohingya. And I will always believe that. But one of the unintended consequences of myself reporting all of these years on the persecution of that community, and all of my peers reporting on the persecution of that community, is that it's almost as if like the constellation of the images that we've created reporting on that have forged together in some kind of unintended way to then create the visual identity that most people in the world have of the community today. And this was a really important moment in that deep reflection for me, to say, I know that there's a whole different side of the story. How can I almost challenge myself as a photographer and what the work that I've done with very, very good intentions? What can I do to challenge my own work in that sense? And so there's one section in that exhibition that I thought was just crucial, and that was informed by Rohingya, who we met with and talked with and everything. But there's a historical component of that exhibition that almost talks about a little bit of the backstory about who the community is. And I would say probably about 3 years ago, on an instinct, I started to approach a lot of older Rohingya that I knew in different countries around the world, and asking them, I'm just curious, like, what kind of visual materials that you have that tells a very different story about the Rohingya, that's about this time in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s that you've never shown with anybody before. You know, what's out there? And a few of the things that people started to share with me really were astonishing. And I kind of felt like, okay, I'm onto something here. You know, let's just see where this can go. And running in parallel with that, of challenging my own work as a photographer, was also this sense of like, it's almost like challenging the way that people think and broaden the way that they think about genocide. I mean, it's very, that is something that is very anchored in legal analysis and everything. But I've always kind of felt, and I know that there's a lot of other people that kind of do too, and that is that, you know, part of that process, the genocidal process, is the elimination of a community's identity, their heritage, who they are. That's been part of the process with the Rohingya community, is this rejection, this exclusion of who they are as a people, and how long they've belonged to a place, and what they've contributed to the greater fabric of Burmese society over all these years. You know, it's been contested, it's been rejected, and everything. And I feel that labeling of the foreignness of the Rohingya community is something that's always been like an underpinning driver behind the acts of physical violence that then meet the definitions of genocide in people's eyes. So for me, it was almost like, what can I do that will challenge myself as a photographer and the work that I've created, but also at the same time, what can I do that will be visually to challenge that narrative that people have come to accept, that has been one of these underpinning drivers of the violence. And so there was almost twofold. And after getting a few of these images back from some of these people in different places around the world, I kind of felt like I was onto something. And that kind of launched what's happened over the past 3 years.
Before we get into that, it's just making me think, as you're saying, that it seems like such a careful balancing act, because on one hand, you want to present the tragic reality of the extreme violence and brutality that they're being faced with, in order that their struggle and their pain and their situation is known as widely to as many people as possible, so that this story is not being ignored, and hopefully something can be done about it. But then the more you push that, and that being pushed for these purposes of wanting attention shown on it, then you run the risk of turning them into a one-dimensional caricature where they're only defined by violence. Mm-hmm. So it almost, I wonder if you ever had a feeling of in your work of wanting to bring this out, that wanting to bring the reality of the harsh brutality they were living under for these purposes of that maybe something good will coming from this, and then all of a sudden feeling that inadvertently perhaps you were contributing to this caricature, which then you wanted to compensate with by bringing these other elements of humanity at play. So I imagine that could be a difficult balance to try to figure out as an observer and a storyteller, how to bring out these different parts, and not just for the purpose of the story, but also for the engagement that you're hoping to engender as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a photojournalist, you are there to report on what's happening in as many different, I feel, from as many different angles as you possibly can. And this has been a regime that has, over successive regimes, has caused a lot of damage to this particular community. Mm-hmm. And states need to be held to account for that. I really do believe that. But I think as a photographer that pretty much has worked almost exclusively on stories about human rights, abuse, the power of the state, like I said, that's one of the unintended consequences of the work. I feel very strongly that I don't devalue any of that work whatsoever, and I think this is one of the reasons why I'm working on this project right now, is because I feel it's reporting on a story related to this community that has not been reported on before. That's, people can view this project as being a historical project, whatever, but it's, in essence, it's a journalistic project that is trying to find information, report on information, and share it with people, analyze it in that process. And I honestly, I feel like maybe I would feel a bit differently if I had not had 18 years of working on this story with this one particular community, knowing all the different nuances and things. But I almost feel like this particular project brings my work with this community full circle in that sense. My involvement with the Rohingya story full circle. And actually, to be honest with you, over all those years of reporting on the atrocities taking place today, I hate to say it, but did it really make any difference? I mean, these are the harsh realities that I think that sometimes we as journalists and everything that we have to come to terms with sometimes, I mean, it is important for the world to know about things, always. But after you followed a story for so long, how has it made a difference? And I think that my work on the Rohingya, that it has contributed to things. But I honestly feel like this particular project right now is something that will leave a lasting legacy and actually have more infinite value to people's better understanding of what's happened than any of my previous work.
So tell us about that.
Yeah. I mean, the whole project at Khaale just kind of came from curiosity and instinct. Mm-hmm. And knowing that there was another side of the Rohingya story that people had never seen before. And I stress the word seen. Mm-hmm. Books have been written about Rohingya history by Rohingya themselves, by scholars, etc. But as a person who works in the visual medium, I can't write about that. I have to show that kind of story. Mm. And so what ended up happening was I ended up kind of, after that first initial exploration into the community and feeling like I was onto something, I started to work with a team of Rohingya in the camps and a couple Rohingya still in Rakhine State. And over a series of months, we collaborated together and went out into the communities to see what people actually had. And what people did have, I think, blew me away. And I think that even for Rohingya themselves, hearing them say, I've heard about this, but I've never seen this. I just could never imagine that someone from my community would have held on to this particular land document from the late 1800s or X, Y, and Z. And so the project just kind of developed in that sense. And all the different materials that were being shared and contributed to the project started to take on almost like a form and a shape from these isolated, singular pieces of documentary heritage that each in itself has its own kind of micro history. But when you put them together like a jigsaw puzzle, it starts to take on a form and a shape that creates almost another portrait of this community that nobody's ever seen before. And what's been really exciting for me about this project is that, in essence, I'm not really the photographer.
Right, yeah.
I mean, these are materials that Rohingya are actively contributing themselves. This is who I am. This is who we are. It's not, me portraying that. I'm just basically helping to make sense of all these materials and being informed by them as to the way to tell this kind of story. And that's been incredibly exciting. And at the same time, as we were working in these different areas, I was in the UK on an academic fellowship for this project. And so I was spending months in doing deep research in various archives. And again, a lot of this material is not, I don't feel like a lot of this material is not something I'm discovering. Past scholars have talked about it and written about it and everything. Certain pieces I feel that have been found through the past year are very unique. But I don't think people have seen these things before, And when you start to show who this community was at a particular period of time, and I mean that's one of the amazing elements of an archive, is that what people might have done and said 40, 50, 60 years ago, you can't transport yourself back there, but what you can do is you can take archives and transport that which was done or said then and place it into the present in a really interesting kind of way, to where you can activate the voice of somebody from the past into a present day conversation where actually what they're saying then has more value now.
Sure.
And that's what's been so exciting. That's been one of the many different elements of this project that's been so exciting, is to be able to find old letters that were written by Rohingya in the 1940s and almost imagine their voice talking to people today. And I think that's providing a lot of context that people have been without for a long period of time. Yet at the same time, I think that the project is, it's allowing people to reimagine, in a sense, because it's visual. It's allowing for people, it's providing a platform for people to reimagine, who this community was at a particular period of time prior to the visual representations that myself and past journalists have made in 1978 and 1991 and in 2015 and 12 and et cetera. You know what I mean? That's, I think, one of the exciting parts of this whole project, is that it's allowing for a different visual representation to almost come into form and shape for people. I think one of the other exciting parts of all this with the project at Khaale, which at Khaale is the Rohingya expression for once upon a time. And we in the West, we associate once upon a time with fairy tales and fables and everything. But for the Rohingya, when you hear that, it's really much talking about a very concrete past that has some pain involved in it. and also some very fond memories. So when I would be in the camps last year, I went twice, and I would talk with an older Rohingya man in his late 60s, early 70s, and as a neutral outsider, it worked to the benefit of this project. Every community has their internal suspicions and everything, but as a neutral outsider, it's actually opened up doors for people to share materials with me that they wouldn't share with anybody else.
Yeah.
You know? And so after talking with a Rohingya man in his late 60s who was a bit skeptical of what we were trying to do, and then coming to the realization of why it's so important, and then him saying, hold on for a second, and him walking into the back of his hut and then coming back out with a whole entire bag filled with documents that he's never shown to anybody, and seeing all these things has been pretty amazing. And then when he says, come back to my hut tomorrow morning at 10, and when we return to his hut the next morning at 10, and there's a line of 10 other Rohingya men standing outside of his door with bags of materials that they had the presence of mind to grab when their homes were being burned in 2017 and carry with them from Butadong all the way over the mountains into Bangladesh. It's validating for them to know that somebody sees the value in these materials that they have known has such important value, not only to them as an individual and their family, but they're the last remaining shreds of their evidence of this belonging that they have claimed and professed for so many decades about belonging to Burma. You know, so when I see fires that sweep through the refugee camps every single year, or right now, the Instagram feeds are filled with the flooding happening in the camps because of the monsoon, or when I read the reports of burning villages in Butadong, you know, over the past 8 months or whatever, I feel heartbroken, not just because of the loss of life, but also at the same time, because of working on this project. I think of all those materials that have such a huge value to the greater story of the Rohingya community that are now being lost as well. And that's what this project is hoping to do. It's hoping to almost, you know, do all those things that I said at the very beginning of the interview, but also at the same time, it's turned into almost like a preservation project too, in that sense, that the digital archive that has been created of some of the materials on this are, you know, they're really important. So, yeah.
So we definitely encourage listeners to check out this website, which will also be included in the show notes, because it's this is the where your project is displayed in its full form, interactive and very well designed, and takes you through this journey. I believe it's 9 chapters of information. So for those, and again, we encourage listeners to check that out, even stop at this moment and go and take a look. But for those that maybe are driving or cooking, don't have a hand free, and will do so later, can you, as best to your ability, lay out what these 9 chapters are, and then some way to impart just the aesthetics, the interactive feel of it, the kind of collage, archival, scrapbook almost feel of how everything comes together, because it's not a traditional website in the way that this is a storytelling mission, and the website is put together as a means, not just in terms of content, but also in terms of the experience of interacting with this website, that the medium itself is a storyteller along with the content actually being told.
I appreciate you saying all that. I mean, it means a lot to hear that that's what you've taken away from it, because that's how it was intended. Yeah, I mean, the website is structured into 9 chapters, and throughout all of those chapters are active Rohingya voice, either from the present day or from the past. That the structure of the website almost takes people with the first few chapters using materials that are very much driven by archival work, establishing the presence of a Muslim community in Arakan centuries ago, but not claiming that this is a community called the Rohingya, you know, but also at the same time being able to at least present things in a way that allow people to make those natural connections historically that you would make over centuries of time, and the development of communities and how they come about, because all communities are like that, you know. I mean, and especially in Burma, that there's been the creation of who communities are today is not something that happened at a specific particular year. It's something that developed over centuries in that sense. And so that's what the beginning chapters of this project are trying to do, is show that through the reporting of people who traveled through Arakan at a particular period of time, through early British colonial time as well, that this was a community that was intact in Arakan historically. And also at the same time using, I think one of the things that comes about in those first chapters is it's really trying to show that the Rohingya community, members of the Rohingya community, were active participants at key moments in Burma's history, pre-independence, post-independence, and not passive bystanders or passive victims, you know. And it's using the stories of certain individuals that are representative of a community, I think. And so those first chapters are really, I would say they're a bit dense in terms of historical materials, but it had to be that way. And the website is designed in a way to where it's not asking people to spend several hours on it all at one time, because we know that that's just an impossibility these days with how people are distracted and attention spans. But it's designed in a way to where it allows people, it's a digital book. It allows people to put a bookmarker and come back to it and then pick up where they might have left off or jump to another particular section. I mean, that's the technique that's been taken in terms of how it's all designed. But also at the same time, it's like, how do you take, because you're relying on flat two-dimensional documents that can be, to anybody's eye, pretty dry, how can you make them almost come to life and speak in a really exciting kind of way? And that's the design technique that's been took months of fine-tuning and exploring and everything, about pulling sentences out and, just those most important parts that you feel like people need to be walking away from. And highlighting, how do you go about doing that in an aesthetic kind of sense online? And I feel like that's been accomplished with the design of it all. So you see that the website then almost takes a historical approach, but then at the same time, there's a fulcrum and a pivot point to where the website then turns away from those archival materials really into those materials that are self-contributed by Rohingya themselves, actively using these materials as or as a sentence within a larger visual paragraph that's being presented that tells the larger story. I mean, that's really how it is, and it kind of compartmentalizes things in terms of what those visual materials are, from a whole entire collection of national registration cards, to a whole entire collection of collage work of different families' materials that not just tell the story of one document, but to allow a portfolio of documents to almost have a conversation amongst themselves that tells the whole entire story of a family, or the whole entire history of one man's professional life as a government servant, which, to work for the government, you had to be a citizen. So it's all these kind of things that the website is trying to kind of convey to people. But I also think that it's, perfect example of showing and not telling would be, Rohingya have always said that they've had people from their community elected as members of parliament. Well, you can't really tell that. You have to show that. So it was my task to go through all the different newspapers from the 1950s and 60s and find the election results where it actually has Sultan Ahmed or Abdul Ghaffar or Abdul Bashir listed on the front page of a newspaper, and showing that to people. And there's so many different exciting examples of of those discoveries. And then I think the final chapter of the whole thing, not to release a spoiler, but really, I mean, it's the final chapter of the whole entire project is just this massive collection of family photographs that are universal in their sense. When you look at some of these photographs, and I've shared them with people who are from different countries all around the region, all around the world, and it doesn't take very long to see a picture of a Rohingya man in the early 1960s where you say, I mean, I've got a picture like that of my dad in Canada, or in the UK, or a photograph of all of my grandparents sitting together that looks identical to that. I mean, it universalizes things, and I think in that sense, it's the strength of this the collection of materials that really tell that kind of story. So yeah, it's been an amazing project to work on, and there's been some epic journeys just in getting some of these materials as well. The stories about how some of these materials have been found are, I'm not going to say as interesting as the larger, but boy, they're pretty epic kind of discoveries along the way.
Tell us one of those.
I think probably one of the biggest ones has been, it has been written about, and Rohingya talk about this, and others have talked about the Rohingya involvement in World War II in Arakan. And just like the Karen, the Kachin, the Chin, communities in Burma sided with the Allied forces instead of the Japanese. And however anyone wants to spin that historically is up to them. But the fact is that in Arakan, the British set up a force called V-Force. And V-Force was an intelligence force where they used indigenous communities behind Japanese enemy lines to provide the eyes and ears of Japanese movements of what was taking place. And in North Arakan, one of the communities, the primary community, was members of the Muslim community of North Arakan, the Rohingya community. And this would have been back, I can't remember exactly what month, but it would have been in 2022, I think it was. One of the team members who was working there came across a portfolio of documents of one man. And two of those documents was an old original passport. His name was Abdul Salam, issued to him in 1949. And one of the other documents was a war service certificate issued to him on June 14th, 1945 by the British government, acknowledging his services towards the war efforts. It's a document that I think a lot of people have never ever seen before. And that kind of sent me on a bit of a goose chase where I started reading books about V-Force and everything. And there was a British soldier, his name was Anthony Irwin, and he wrote a book called Burmese Outpost. And there's 3 chapters, and in one of those chapters, the first chapter, all he does is write about the Muslim community of Arakan, the Rohingya community, and their services towards the British and V-Force. And in that book, he mentions the names of several men. And one of the men that he mentions is Abdul Salam. And I was thinking, this can't be, but it is. We cross-referenced. The man that he talks about, Abdul Salam, is the man that we found the documents for several months even before I read this book. And then that sent me in this other rabbit hole. I wonder if I can find the family of Anthony Irwin here in the UK and see what materials, if they have any. That dream situation of, could you find a British soldier that fought in North Arakan with the Rohingya and somehow carried a camera with him and took pictures, And one thing led to the next, and I was able to find the living relatives of Anthony Irwin, and his son, who's in his early 80s, and his daughter, who's in her 70s. And when I told them about this project and what we had found, and there were certain passages within his book that were quite profound about the British's responsibility towards ethnic communities, which they obviously did not live up to.
Right.
And he was very vocal about that, which I found to be very inspirational. Yeah. But when I told his daughter about this project, she said, I think you need to come to my house. And so my partner and I, she was visiting me at the time, we went out to this tiny little hamlet in the middle of Oxfordshire and walked into her house. And on the floor were these 2 1940-style suitcases that were opened up, filled with papers and diaries. And she said, I have 2 materials here that I think would be of interest to you. And one was a photo album. And on the spine was labeled Arakan 1943. And when I opened up the photo album, one of the first pictures was an 8x6 black and white print of her father standing with a whole entire group of young Rohingya operatives for V-Force at guerrilla headquarters in Tong Bazaar. Yeah. dated 1943. I mean, it's a visual that just anchors so many different things, you know, and that I'm convinced has never seen the light of day since 1944.
That is so cool.
You know,
that's amazing.
And it just, again, it's a visual validation. It's a visual representation. It's something that supports a story that has been rejected and contested and even put into myth in a sense, you know. But at the same time, here this project has been able to find this material. In the back of Anthony Irwin's book are 2 letters that he exchanged with a young Rohingya man named Wajidullah. And those letters were exchanged in 1944 or 1945. And those 2 letters that are published in the back of that book are not of any kind of significant historical significance, but it shows the connection, the active voice of someone from the Rohingya community with this British soldier at that time, the rapport that the 2 of them had, this friendly camaraderie and this respect that each one of them have for each other. And that respect, was not just didn't appear out of nowhere. It was something that was earned from both of them on both sides. But one of the other materials that was shown to me and his family was a 3rd unpublished letter that was sent by Wajidullah to her father. And it's this 3rd letter that is really profound. It was dated, I believe, in March of 1946. So this is, you know, fresh off of the war ending. Burma's in turmoil all over the country. Constituent Assembly had not even, you know, gotten to that particular point. Burma clearly was not an independent country. But in this letter, this man wrote about how communities all over the country were protesting and demonstrating for freedom. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said to a degree, I don't agree with the protesters and demonstrators. I believe in the power of the Constitution. I believe that the Constitution will be the honest master. If freedom is going to come, it will come constitutionally. So here you have a Rohingya man in 1946 placing so much faith in the rule of law and constitution over man in making these decisions about equality and rights. It shows the active voice of someone from this community in a way that I don't think anybody has ever imagined was possible. And the belief in this new country, you know, and that's so completely counter to what the narrative that has been created about the Rohingya community over all these decades, that this is a community that, you know, I don't need to say it, really. I'm just reinforcing it if I talk about it. But here you have a man in 1946 talking about this. It was just so profound. But yet at the same time, we know that it would be the change of a law 40 years later that would end up in many ways betraying the Rohingya community with the 1982 citizenship law. And that was very much driven by man in that sense. So, you know, these little pieces of history are not just pieces of history. They're activating Rohingya voice over a course of decades in a way that I think people have never experienced or heard before or been exposed to before. And I think that it's a really powerful thing to have the privilege to be a part of that process.
That's an incredible story, and it's a very imperfect example, but I can't hear that and not think of the historical example of African Americans that also had their own divisions in World War II, and there's many things about these examples that don't line up in terms of the contrast, but there is something that rings true in some way because there's something about putting on a uniform and sacrificing and fighting that brings about a legitimacy of some kind by definition. And so to reflect on these Rohingya, and this one Rohingya man in particular who was enlisted and through the camaraderie, obviously a good soldier and loyal for the cause that he was fighting, and that this is going above and beyond the mere fact of citizenship and legitimacy. This is the ultimate sacrifice. And again, the examples aren't perfect by any means because it's colonial Burma and, you know, on and on and on. But But if you just kind of remove all of those historical oddities that don't match up on either side, but you just look at what it means to put the legitimacy of putting on a uniform and risking the greatest thing you could risk, and then being denied and having your past history itself removed, and legitimacy with that, these things don't exactly line up.
Absolutely. I think that what's been so fascinating for me is that, in working on this project, is that this project is in no way is claiming to be the authoritative history. I mean, it's not. But at the same time, what it is doing is that it is showing these key moments along a historical timeline where members from this community were actively participating. And if you isolate each one of those by themselves, it's pretty extraordinary. But when you sew all of those points of history together, again, you end up seeing a community that has very, very deep sense of belonging in the face of so much antagonism against them, decade after decade after decade, saying we belong here, we're from here, and doing whatever they particularly can, just like every other community throughout the country, of trying to do what needed to be done to stake their claim in that society too, through self-preservation, through politically, through arms. Well, and that's when you look back at history, you end up realizing that the Rohingya community was in a way, as much as they've been positioned as being the other, they're very similar in that sense towards their actions of what other communities were going through over those decades too, politically participating politically, demanding their rights, demanding their stake in terms of their recognition of their identity, participating economically. I mean, all of those things. So, it's been an amazing project to work on.
And again, looking after the 2021 coup, we referenced the three fingers and the meaning that had. Another important moment was in just the weeks after the coup, maybe even the first week, I don't remember the exact date, as you had all of these different groups out protesting. You had the memes and humor and music and all this other. You had a Rohingya group that was marching in lockstep with many of the others after the coup with posters and signs saying, "We are Rohingya." And that was also considered by many to be something of a watershed moment, that they were self-identifying, that they seemed to be welcomed with the others that were walking. It was, some commented, this was probably the military's absolute greatest fear, that they had taken an action that within days had seemingly reversed all of this hatred and racism they tried to sow, at least in some superficial form. But what were your thoughts on seeing that, the symbolism, the meaning, and the potential importance of those moments?
Well, I mean, I think the symbolism, the importance, just goes back to kind of what we said at the very beginning of our talk. I mean, I think it was incredibly inspiring to see that happen and take place. I think that it was another show of solidarity with other communities across the country who, in a lot of ways, have not accepted this community. And at the same time, I think that it's one more gesture of how much this community believes that they are part and parcel of the country. So for me, I was very inspired to see pictures like that coming out right after immediately after everything took place. Yeah.
So I want to close in asking some questions about Rohingya culture. And the reason for this is that so much of your project and your concern has been in wanting to flesh out this full humanity and not define them in this one-dimensional kind of way of violence. And so you reference the background they have in poetry. This was something, the literary style and poetic influence was something that really impressed you about Rohingya people. I don't know if you want to go in that direction more. Also, just curiosity about food or language or music or whatever else of the sides of culture and humanity you want to bring out, so we can have this more full picture of this people.
I think that what I meant when I was talking about that, it was that it wasn't so much about literally poetry. Mm-hmm. It was just that what captured me so much was just the way that Rohingya were able to articulate how they felt after having experienced so much trauma and pain. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've come to know the community and all of those qualities that make them, in my eyes, a really unique community that has so much to, and has contributed so much. I don't think I'm the. I would think I would much rather hear a Rohingya talk about their culture and all those characteristics than for me to be the one talking about it. Mm-hmm. That's personally, because I think that they can help add more color about those unique characteristics than probably I could. No, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to sit and talk with you and share the story of the project and my background with the story. The over the next month, the last 3 chapters are going to be released, and then after that, there's going to be really hopefully a series of exhibitions and a book that will end up coming out over the next year or two.
Awesome.
I'm really hopeful of that. But I think that there's some, I'm happy to be here in Chiang Mai, because I think that, we're convening where mostly a lot of young scholars from Burma are going to be converging on Chiang Mai University, and they have a lot of different perspectives on things. And I think that I'm excited to see how this project can be inserted into those kind of conversations that are happening here. And also at the same time, how the project can then find its way into discussions and debate happening internationally, not just from Westerners, but primarily within the Rohingya community themselves, and how they're utilizing these materials that they've contributed to show people and speak for themselves too. So, yeah.
Great. Many listeners know that in addition to running these podcast episodes, we also run a nonprofit, Better Burma, which carries out humanitarian projects across Myanmar. While we regularly post about current needs and proposals from groups on the ground, we also handle emergency requests, often in matters that are quite literally life or death. When those urgent requests come in, we have no time to conduct targeted fundraisers, as these funds are often needed within hours. So please consider helping us to maintain this emergency fund. We want to stress that literally any amount you can give allows us to respond more flexibly and effectively when disaster strikes. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam